Hello and welcome to BC Ed Access's AdvoCon session, IEPs and Language. My name is Ann Whitmore and I will be your facilitator for this session. My pronouns are she, her. And just a little visual description of me. I'm a 46-year-old Korean woman with newly cut chin length hair, kind of messy, especially at the end of the day. I have a fairly expressive face and I am very often just laughing at myself. I'm a mom of four. They're 4, 6, 8, and 27. My oldest has ADHD and lives with the ups and downs of bipolar and other concurrent disorders. One of my other daughters was recently diagnosed with autism, mild intellectual disability, coordination, and severe speech disorders. And we're going through the process of sensory processing assessments with another kid. So I've lived through changes in education and support for my kids and the IEP process several times, and I am incredibly grateful for the community here at BC Ed Access. Our Zoom tech host for this session is Bobby Taylor, and I always enjoy working with Bobby. Her kindness, her insightfulness, and her resourcefulness always cut through, and she's always great for a chuckle as well. We begin this session by acknowledging the land where we gather, and in this virtual environment, I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Kakite First Nation, as well as Musqueam, Quitwitlam, Katsi, Kwantlen land, and traveling grounds for the Hunkamanam and Halkamalam speaking peoples. And I express my gratitude to the traditional stewards of this land. I speak also as, I learn and unlearn and learn with the recent discovery of the KRS 215 children, which is no surprise to our Indigenous friends. I learned about the story about where I live and how the current chief's mother, aunt, and uncle were the last members of the Kakite taken to KRS, and the land was seized by the government. And that years later, the Chief Larrabee, had to fight to regain First Nation status here. They are still the only First Nation registered with no land base. I say this also because, again, as advocates in access to education, we are often addressing that intersectionality of discrimination against disability, racism, and colonialism. So I commit to continual learning, unlearning, and striving to be an ally. This session is all about equipping you with confidence to be ready for the Individual Education Plan, or IEP. The process can be, for some, very overwhelming or even frustrating. Suzanne Pellereau is here to fill up your toolbox so that you know that language shapes the IEP and what you want it to say so that your child is supported. Suzanne is a mother of 3 and a Langley School District trustee. She's also a former administrator of a private vocational school and has worked as an SEA and a TEDx talk speaker. She currently works as a youth and women's counselor in Langley, British Columbia, is a public speaker and the recent president of the Langley DPAT for 3 consecutive years. She's been attending various committees such as SD35's Inclusive Education Working Committee, Emergency Preparedness, and has been nominated for both the Fraser Valley Diversity Award and the BC Excellence in Autism Awards. She has successfully worked alongside educators and parents, creating positive changes in school climate, as well as parent engagement, based on focusing the communication process as it interfaces with the journey having a child with needs. She's advised and worked on committees with BCC PAC, the BC Ed Task Force, or BC Ed Access Task Force, and other agencies to help promote educational change in areas of inclusion, wellness, leadership, motivation, and parent engagement. Her primary focus is the success of students by virtue of bridging educators and parents. And as we spoke just before this session, I was struck by her clear and confidence in the importance of equipping parents and caregivers to advocate for the right language in your child's IEP. And so please help me welcome Suzanne. Oh, Suzanne, you're muted. I do that all the time.
There we go.
Great.
See, I know I had it on and we got turned off for the intro and then I forgot.
It's all good.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you to each of you participants who are here today to be with us. I'm going to do a little introduction of myself. My pronouns are she and her. My name is Suzanne Perot. My visual descriptions, I have long, dark brown hair, sometimes wavy. Right now it's wavy, sometimes it's straight. I don't know my facial expressions. I love that, Anne, that you communicated that you have a lot of facial expressions. I don't know if I do or not. So I'm like, now I'm going to be conscious of watching myself. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a white shirt with a orange shirt for Orange Shirt Day that was made locally by one of our local Indigenous artists who beaded it for me specifically. I'm in my home office and behind me is a tree that's wire framed with leaves on it and a bookcase with some neat little memorabilia that different clients have given to me as a point of encouragement. The land acknowledgements in terms of where I'm coming from, I'm residing on the Kwantlen, Kaitsit, Matsquit, and Semiahoo First Nations. I also want to just make a subtle correction. I am not the current president of Langley DPAC. However, I used to be before I became a trustee. I'm in my first term of Langley, a trustee here in Langley, BC. And I also, as Anne said, I am a parent. I'm a birth mother of 3 children, but I also am a stepmom of 5 others. So in total, I have 8. So my quiver is full and my heart is fuller. And my 3 children to whom I birthed, we're a neurodiverse family and we sit on the conversation of intersectionality. I myself identify as autistic and I'm Métis. And my children are diagnosed autistic as well with ADHD and high anxiety and sensory processing disorder and a few other co-occurring diagnoses that walk along there. My children are young adults now. I just graduated my last child in June of this year who was deemed not to graduate when he was first diagnosed. When he was small, he was diagnosed by 2 doctors and it took 4 months. And at that time, they indicated that he probably won't read, he won't write, and he won't graduate and get ready for the long haul in your parenting role with a child at home with disabilities. And I thought, okay, I understand the diagnosis in terms of the autistic brain, the ADHD, the sensory processing. I'm not sure if I'm in agreement with the rest because I had already at that time been homeschooling my children as a whole. I've homeschooled, I've unschooled, I've done distributed learning, I've done private school and brick and mortar. So when I come into today's presentation, I'm coming with a whole spectrum of education outlooks on how we work with our children and the education system as a whole. Why I'm on this journey with you is not only because I'm a parent, but because of my own journey as a child growing up, unsupported, undiagnosed, and then becoming a parent with children with disabilities and observing the impacts on not only my children, but myself and the relationship that ensues with self and then others as a byproduct. So with others, meaning how my relationship worked with the schools initially, how my relationship engaged in my family structure, and how my kids were engaging, and recognizing that the level of oppression that was occurring and the frustration due to the lack of supports and understanding of how to advocate in the system way back then was so complex and confusing and oppressive that I got frustrated, and my frustration is what motivated me to action, frankly. And so in my journey, as I moved towards advocacy, I found myself at 43 having a marital breakdown, a sudden marital breakdown. This is an important part of the story, my journey, and why I do what I do, because at that point in time, it really forced me to face myself and what I was going to do in terms of providing for my children, because I was already at that time a stay-at-home mom and I was homeschooling. And so I had to figure out, what am I going to do to be able to sustain my children, maintain their educational track, and provide and keep going. So when I hit that wall and landed on my knees, literally and proverbially, I had to do some deep soul searching about who I am, what do I purpose for, and why. And in that journey, I reconciled myself to go back to school. So I took out a student loan and supported me and the babies. They weren't babies, but they were youth, coming into youth and youth. And away I went, put myself through school to support other women who were walking through the same kind of journey as I was, to support families so that their children can succeed. Because at the end of the day, everything I do is about children and helping them succeed. So in that journey then came the understanding that in order to help this process further, that we need to change policy. And policy happens at the government level. So then I decided, I had this great idea that I should go in campaign and become a trustee if I could. And so here we are. So I am a counselor, as Anne has communicated. I also am a school trustee, and I also am a consultant, and I spend a good amount of my time consulting into school districts, working with staff and leadership teams on the IEP process, supporting them to support parents, and how to reframe language. And that's the seat of our conversation today, is how do we really look at these conversations within the IEP to make them stable for the child and the school, so it works together. And I also work with educators on trauma-informed practices for the classroom, because that becomes a very important part of what we do in the classroom. And when working with children, especially our children with disabilities, we need to understand who we are as leaders. We hear a very strong conversation in community, and it's an important conversation about self-regulation. In my leadership role, I believe before one can self-regulate, especially children, they need to have someone co-regulate with them. So when I take schools through trauma-informed practices, I'm working on that co-regulation conversation. What does co-regulation look like, and where does it begin? It begins with self as adults and get tapped in. So I'm doing the IEP and language with schools. I'm doing trauma-informed practices, and I'm also doing ableism and schools. And that one's really involved, where the systemic and systematic language, again, is impacting our practice as educators and clinicians, and how it filters down into the classroom and impacts our students and the potential outcomes of who they are as a person, and therefore affecting academics. So that gives you a little bit about who I am today and why I'm here and why it's my passion. Had I submitted to the thought process and the delivery of information of what the two psychologists offered my son and me that day, my son wouldn't have graduated. And so when I walk and do these conversations, I'm encouraging parents to trust yourself, trust your journey, trust your instincts, trust your understanding of your child. You're the child's lead. So you're going to hear me reference periodically my journey personally. Why? Because I can speak to it. I have my children's permission, and it gives you that opportunity to gain some insight. But as we're going through this, as in any of my presentations, I want to encourage you to be mindful of where you're at, to be sure that you're doing a check-in on yourself through this journey, like through all of AdvoCon, and we're coming into IEP season. It's a high stress season combined with the global trauma experience that we're having with COVID, that I just want to encourage each of you to be mindful of caring for yourself and doing this check-in on yourself. Is your heart rate increasing? Are you breathing shallow? Are you feeling tense? Are you clenching your jaws? Are you pushing your feet hard into the ground? There's different things that you might be doing to let you know that, oh, I'm feeling something right now. And so I just want to get you to do those check-ins and take a moment to loosen yourself up and breathe it out. And if some big thoughts come for you, write them down. Make sure you keep them so that you don't lose it, because when our anxiety lifts, we tend to forget information, even though it's coming clear in the moment. We have that experience of loss of information periodically afterwards. So make sure you're taking notes. I don't know how many participants we have here today to be able to gauge whether or not we can do real-time questioning, but for sure, no matter what, At the end of the presentation, I will take questions from you, and we'll look at potentially, depend on time, what does some language look like in the IEP and how we can reframe it. So that's going to be the key thing that you're going to be learning today, is that reframing piece and how do we go forward. So, and if I can share the screen now, if that's okay. So we're going to go into the presentation, and I want you to know also, and I'll repeat it again at the end, you can find my information if you need further or need to talk privately at another time, because some questions may come up at a later date when you're laying in bed and things are percolating, or you're moving close to the IEP date that you're going to have your meeting. You might go, hey, I have a question. Please feel free to reach out to me. I have a counseling page, a counseling consultant page on Facebook, and just tap into Messenger and I will come and respond to you, and we can go through those conversations. If we need to do a Zoom session or a phone call briefly, we can do those things as well. I make myself available. You're going to be looking for the fulsome language that's on this page for my counseling page. So Suzanne Perot, counselor and consultant, inclusive ed consultant, not just Suzanne Perot. If you go to that, you're coming to me personally, and I may not get that. So I just want you to be aware of that. All right, so here we are going forward. So IEP and language. So I'd already done, usually at this point, I'm walking through what I've already walked through, and it's really at the end of this presentation, my heart for you is to have a grasp on the importance of language in your IEP. What is the IEP cycle, and what you can be expecting and or anticipating coming through these journeys as you progress through the academic calendar years with your kiddos at school. So what I want you to do is ask yourself, where do we begin? So you're asking yourself these important questions. What is an IEP? Why do I need to have this? IEP is short for Individual Education Plan. Very simple. That Individual Education Plan is the learning guide for the implementation of the curriculum. So it's what the curriculum is going to sit on top of and drive that engine forward for your students. And the purpose of it is to help support the child in the classroom and giving that educator insight to what that child needs as support. So it's the guide to the implementation of the learning plan. You're going to hear that come up frequently throughout the presentation. There's going to be some language we're going to talk about. Please take notes. It's really, really good to have the notes so that you have those pieces to defer back to, because if somebody tells you the IEP, well, it's okay, you don't need to worry about it right now. Well, you do need to worry about it, because you want to say it's the guide to the implementation of the learning plan for my child. Because my child has a diagnosis, we need that guide. So that's language from the Ministry Act. So when I'm using, there's going to be key language I'll be using that comes right out of the ministry, and that's one of them, the guide to the implementation of the learning plan. So part of your key questions that you're asking yourself is discerning where to start advocating for your children. What are the key things you need to focus on? So only you can answer that. You know your child best. You may have a team around you that is going to give you input. So you may have a speech language pathologist, an occupational therapist, and a BI, an RDI. So whomever your team is, they're going to give you recommendations, and you're also going to receive recommendations coming in through that psych ed report. Like myself, I will always encourage you to make sure you're analyzing well, even the psych ed report. For example, when the precursor report came in for my son, my youngest, and you'll hear me cite his journey the most, because his was the most impacting on a lot of different levels, both clinically as well as academically. There was lots of work to be done there. His initial recommendation was he had ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. That is not, and it's a common diagnosis when they don't understand what's going on. Had I not had the gut instinct to resist that and say, I don't agree with that, and went and did my research, this child would have been stuck with something that would have labeled him as behavioral. And that's become some of the language that we get sensitive to. So that ODD thing became really challenged. What we know now, he's 18 now, going into his 19th year. When he was diagnosed at 7, that was really PDA, pathological demand avoidance, showing up. And it could have been a really difficult thing had I not had a principal also say to me, who trusted my insight, say, get that diagnosis off that documentation right away. It won't support your child going through the system. I can't even tell you how many times I thank this lady over the years for telling me that and giving me and having the courage to say that to me. So understand what you're advocating for and where you're starting. So the starting is looking at those documentations, listening to your team and going, what are the key goals? And listening to yourself, engaging your child and paying attention. What is my child passionate about? What is my child like doing? When my guy was little, he loved tractors. He loved construction. I used to have to take him to construction sites. He would dig holes literally in my garden, dig up my garden, and hide his tractors and stuff in there and then go back the next day to reveal them. Well, that gave me insight that this guy was a kinetic learner. He loved movement when he was learning, and he loved machinery. Right now, he's level 1 trades for sprinkler fitting. He received that while he was doing his grade 12 year. He graduated with his dogwood with the level 1 trades for a kiddo who wasn't supposed to read, write, or graduate. So pay attention is what I want you to do. I want you to be questioning yourself, what is advocacy versus activism? So advocacy is creating that bridge, and that's what I'm always going to be encouraging you to do, is creating that bridge on behalf of your child. And that's what advocacy is, speaking on behalf of a person or a group. And so that's what we're doing right here with BC Ed Access. That's what we do. We're endeavoring to create that support system, that support network, so that you can start doing that advocacy independently and confidently. And what does advocacy do for us? It keeps us away from what's called learned helplessness. And so some of you may ask yourself, well, what is learned helplessness? Learned helplessness is when we fall into that place of, well, that's the way it's going to be. So, for example, had I received that diagnosis on my son in its fulsome way, I would have resigned and went, that's the way it's going to be. That's what the doctor said, so therefore it must be. That's learned helplessness. And I would have acted that out with him and not challenged my guy to expand and grow and be stretched. Instead, I went, no, I need to advocate for this guy because it's not resonating with me. It didn't feel right. So I kept pushing at the boundaries and going, okay, what's different? What's not connecting in me in relationship to what they are saying, and how do I shift it? And develop those relationships to get that good relationship going, and sometimes tough and sometimes super tough, and sometimes you close the door. And that's still part of advocacy. It's super important. So I want you to be asking yourself those questions as we're going forward. Always keep them in the back of your head year after year, all right? All right, so here we go into the IEP process. The IEP has 7 stages in it. It's always the same. And so this is called the planning cycle, and it starts at the assessment stage. So when we're talking about language, and we're just starting off the IEP cycle, the assessment is actually what we're doing at the doctor's office. It's not at the school, it starts at the doctor's office. So you're going to the doctors, you're getting a referral, you may go into a child psychologist and then a child development psychologist who refers you off to another psychologist, and then you're getting these assessments done. So that's the beginning, very beginning of assessments. And then we move that into the schools to start collaborating on those pieces of information. When you have those assessments done, some of your schools may tell you the full assessment needs to come in. It does not. The first couple of pages are going to be like your family history. And then it goes into what the diagnoses are and what the supports are and what those stats are that they've been measured on. That's what they need. They don't need the family history. You don't need to submit that. That's personal information. It's okay to pull that out and just give them that information. So when you're going into that collaboration process, that's the big pieces that you're bringing in from assessments. That collaboration process now is where the IEP development begins. So in that IEP development, we're going to talk about things like, what do you think your child's strengths are? Right now, language is challenges. I like personally growing edges. Again, it's more mindful of the person we're speaking of. What are their growing edges? What is Lee's growing edges? So we're going to talk about those things, bring them to the table. So my little guy's growing edges was speech, being able to trust the environment and his leaders, sensory processing. He would get overloaded very quickly. And when he got overloaded, he would elope, meaning he'd take off. Sometimes he'd go under a desk, but most times he'd leave the classroom and sometimes the school. So those were our big growing edges. And then we look at what are the things we can do to support all of that. At that point, that's where we start looking at what are the supports. And then that IEP writing begins. So the school will start writing it. The school-based team will start writing. And then they should give you a copy to look at and say, what do you think, mom and dad? And you look at it and you go, yep, this is great, or nope, we missed this, or we need to change the language or expand or add a few things for supports on the side as options. And it's always good to have a supplementary option. I know we're working on provincially looking at the core competency IEP. I got lots of question marks around it, and I'll be very straightforward and forthright about that. Please ensure that you're always including options for supports. Don't keep it rigid into what they've offered. Keep a supplementary support piece there, because sometimes the standard mill isn't going to work. Just like same thing doesn't always work for us. Some days a cup of tea is a great support system for me. It really is. It's like, oh, I needed that. Other days it's a nap. Another day it might be tea, nap, and a walk. Sometimes I might need to phone Anne and say, Anne, I need to talk to somebody in process. So we need to make sure we have those options available for our kiddos, and so that that classroom teacher has a tool to work with, an additional tool. The introduction is where the implementation of the learning plan begins. It's what's coming into the classroom. We're going, okay, here we go. The teacher's getting it, the SEA is getting it. If there's other education support systems around, maybe it's a middle school or high school, they're getting it. Resource teacher, counselor, whomever's going to be working with the child will be introduced to this. And then what we're going to go into is the monitoring piece. So that's where we're observing, and where you see on the IEPs in terms of, the evaluation, how are we monitoring this, and what is the strategies. And so this is what they're going to be looking at. They're going to be looking at those processes on how to support and adjust subtly. And that's going to fluctuate into that reviewing stage. That reviewing stage and reporting almost marry together. And they often happen very close together. Some schools who have a very strong, inclusive team at the school, that reviewing and monitoring piece becomes closer together throughout the year. On schools that are a little more depleted in support staff, the reviewing and monitoring becomes closer together. So you'll see this interesting swing, depends on what's going on in your district and in the school individually. Then we go into the reporting. That's your report card with the attachment summary of how Lee is doing. And then we go back into assessments. Now the assessment language changes the new year that we turn around, because we're not looking necessarily at brand new medical assessments, but we're looking at how the testing has gone throughout the year. How has assignment building gone? Was Lee able to meet some of those goals and outcomes? So they're assessing that now. And then we start again into that collaboration piece and moving that information forward into a new year. So do you know the language? So I'm going to go through a few key components of the language of the IEP so that you're clear on the language and you know what you're advocating for, because it's really, really important. Sometimes, and it's rare, but it does happen, even some of our educators don't know the language. So it's important that as the team leader, which is you know the language. So first, we're going to go into adaptations. So adaptations are teaching and assessment strategies, especially designed to accommodate a student's needs so he or she can achieve those learning outcomes of the subject course. Okay, so essentially what we're doing, adaptations are the best practice. That's kind of what we go to as our typical approach. That should always be the first approach. So for example, with my children, 2 out of my 3, delayed executive function was significant enough that we had to chunk up all the work, and then we delivered it in pieces versus giving full sheets. When it came to math, for example, especially in the primary years, we separated, they would get those math sheets that had addition and subtraction, for example, and they'd be scrambled all together. And you would see that, my kiddo was doing really great on addition, and the subtraction would show up in the line. They'd get it wrong, and then it'd come back to addition and subtraction would be wrong. And so the assumption was my kiddo didn't know how to do subtraction. But if you orally tested, all his math was perfect. So what we realized that because of delayed executive functioning, he wasn't transitioning. That's a huge challenge for our kiddos. That transition piece becomes almost like the cornerstone challenge for most of our kiddos in the classroom. So chunking is separating the addition from the subtraction, and he's still on the dogwood pathway. All right. So the adaptations is keeping us towards the graduation diploma. Then we go into modifications. So you're going to see on the cover often now on the new IEPs that are coming out, it's going to say individual program. It should say program adapted, program is modified. If it says no and no, they didn't fill out the IEP properly. You can't have an IEP without an adaptation, period, right? The adaptation is the best practice. We're adjusting something in the classroom, we're changing the seating location, we might be using fidget tools, we might be doing those chunking of the assignments, we might be creating more sensory breaks, whatever. The modification is different. The modification is instructional and assessment related decisions. So again, instructional and assessment related decisions that accommodate the student's educational needs. So for example, my kiddo, my youngest one, here we go again, couldn't read until midway through grade 4. So he had to have modifications that allowed him to participate in reading. And because he couldn't read at his grade level, he couldn't do that independent reading. The adaptation came in that he had a reader for him. He could cognitively internalize it, but he couldn't read it. But when it came time to, you have to read your own material, well, now we had to do modifications. Okay, so it's a significant shift in the curriculum. And when those shifts come at that level, what we're doing is recognizing that students unable to access that part of the curriculum. Okay, so because that student can't access for whatever the reasons are, they go on that modification shift in the IEP. The modification moves a child towards what's called an evergreen certificate. Now, I don't want to startle you in this conversation. In our elementary years, in our primary years, to be able to toggle back and forth between adaptation and modification is okay and typical experiences for our kiddos. It's safe, it's good for them. If they need it, it's good for them, period. If it's what they need, it's good for them. Doesn't matter where they are in the educational system. If though, with my guy, when he was midway through grade 4, his anxiety went through the roof. He was throwing up every day coming home. I was doing DL. I can't say every day because he was only in school 2 times a week, but when he was coming home, he was throwing up. His anxiety was so high and it just was going sideways. So I pulled him and I unschooled him. And during that time of unschooling, that's when the window opened up and he started to read. So by the time grade 5 came, he was actually just above grade 5 reading level. When midway grade 4, he was emerging grade 1. So emerging grade 1 means he was just coming into grade 1. And so I took him home, removed all stressors, all demands, and went, we're just going to breathe this out. And I'm going to follow his lead. And that's what I did. I followed his lead. And by the time we hit grade 5, he was reading just above reading level. And it was a really profound experience to witness what happens when we pull back those stressors and allow the child to breathe. I did modifications right across the board. In that case, it just dropped, literally just dropped everything. So in this case, it worked really well for this guy. But as we move forward, by grade 8, I moved him back into brick and mortar full time. Actually, he was in brick and mortar for kindergarten, part of grade 1, then he didn't go back full time till grade 8. And when he went into grade 8, I then pushed towards the conversation of full adaptations, because now we're pushing towards the credit system and gearing him up. And at that time, it was like, okay, right now we're just looking at integration. We're not looking at grades, but we're still going to do the curriculum outcomes and see where we can go with that. So the importance of this story is making sure in your IEP, you're paying attention to the checkboxes and the language, because sometimes people confuse adaptation and modifications as the same thing, and they absolutely are not. If your child does not need to have modifications and they're going into their senior year, 10, 11, and 12, and they're still on modifications but don't need it, but that's showing up on the IEP, that could impact their opportunity for graduation. So it's the reason why I'm punctuating that, because that piece becomes important for some of our families. Okay, so assessments. It's a gathering of information to make the appropriate educational decisions. We've talked about that. So the initial gathering of information was from the doctors. And then after that, it's what's going on through the school year. And, you know, sometimes where the OT is coming in and the SLP is coming in, speech language pathologist, OT is occupational therapist, pulling that information in, those new assessments that come in periodically throughout the year, and ensuring that the school has copies of that. Please, anytime you get assessments, do not give the schools the original copies. Always keep the originals for yourself. Super important, keep them in a file for yourself. And we'll be talking a little bit about that after. All right, collaborative consultation. So this is something that our schools are required to offer parents, collaborative consultation. It's where we come together to solve our problems for that collaborative outcome, and it's voluntary, meaning you don't have to show up if you don't want to. I would never encourage it, but it is voluntary, and the schools are required to offer that opportunity for consultation with you. So I want you to be aware of that. Sometimes I've had parents literally come to me and say, well, I was given an IEP and told that, you know, we didn't need to have a meeting, that they're going to do it and it's okay. It's not okay. You by law, in terms of the BC Educational Act, are allowed to be invited and in those meetings. Only you get to decline. Okay, so integration. The integration is the major strategies used for inclusion to provide accommodations. So that integration might look like the use of UDL, part of that new curriculum that we talk about a lot, universal design and learning. And that's where we start looking at the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how, and using that tool of engagement and representation to help move it into the active expression of learning. And so that integration becomes a really important part of that. The other important component of integration is how the supports come in. And so I want you to be aware of what that looks like. Later in the presentation, you will get exposed to a link, and it will be in the handouts as well for you. So I don't want you to worry about having to write it down. But I do want you to be sure you have always a copy of what's called the Special Education Services Manual, Policies and Guidelines and Procedures. It's on the Ministry of Education website, and it's part of the Act, actually. So when we have a child who has an IEP, that becomes part of that protecting living, breathing document that supports our children in the classroom, and it also helps the schools understand what they need to do in order to support our children. Okay, so again, that's called the Special Education Services, a Manual of Policies, Procedures, and Guidelines. It's being updated right now, so you're going to see in that guideline what's called redacted. You're going to see redacted in it repeatedly throughout the document. That's because they're working on a new document. There's a new one supposed to be out this fall is what the rumor is. I don't know for sure, That's just what I'm hearing. But it's still important to have, and it's one of those living, breathing documents where when you have your binder, and I will be talking to you how to make one, you want to highlight the pieces that impact your child for that year, because your child changes and your child will develop and grow at whatever pace your child is going to do. Parts of that document will actually speak to what's going on for that kiddo, and it becomes a supporting conversation for you at those IEP meetings. And then advocacy again. So advocacy is I'm coming to the school, I'm advocating for my child, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to say, I'm advocating for my child. I'm here. I want to support my child. What do you need from me to support you to support my child? It's that kind of collaborative language I always want to encourage our families to be working towards, even if the environment isn't favorable. Keep yourself in that favorable place. It's in your child's benefit. And the reason why is because we need to make sure we're not putting pressure on the child inadvertently by accident, because we're getting elevated. Because when we're elevated, we can get our teachers elevated. And sometimes when our teachers are elevated, they get us elevated. And our kiddos are super intuitive and super tender in their hearts. And when they know the grown-ups are having a hard time and they think it's about them, they're going to try to lift up those big people so that they succeed and the relationship works, because they don't want people having a hard time because of them. And kiddos figure these things out really quickly, just like they do in our family structures. They figure those things out, and sometimes they either become perfectionists or they struggle with high anxiety and they start shutting down. So we don't want that pressure coming down on our kiddos so that they're dealing with more challenges than necessary. So that's part of what we need to do to get ourselves ready, is understanding what does advocacy mean. The other part, and for those of you who've heard me speak in various different avenues and venues, self-care. I started off already today talking about self-care, and it's super critical because our journey, it's a long haul. And it's complex because the system's complex because it's steeped in historical ableism, systemically and systematically. And so we're constantly trying to work at those gears to change it. And it's challenging, and it's exhausting and isolating. A lot of times we go into school and people don't even recognize what we're working with in terms of the system and how isolating it is. And so what ends up happening is we're dropping our kiddos off at school. We're going in and out. Mamas are over here, groups of mom talking, and it's like, hi, and you're on your own. And so that self-care becomes super, super important. So as we're getting ready for that IEP meeting, I want you guys to be thinking about different pieces. So the one piece is recognizing where your triggers are in the meetings, because we all have them, without a doubt. I spent 18 years in the system, and hands down, when I have been spoken to in a patronizing manner that my child's disability wasn't that bad, or they can't see it because they're autistic, it's like instant for me. I'm instantly like in fight flight mode, not flight. I go into fight mode. That's my deal. I don't escape very easily. And so understanding my triggers becomes a really important part of that conversation, and recognizing it so that I can front load myself and be ready for these situations. The other part is eating well, sleeping well. And when I say eating well, especially the day of the meeting, it means getting some protein in you and something, some vegetables or fruit, so that you don't go in elevated and spike because a blood sugar drop, and all of a sudden you drop, you're shaky, your brain's racing, and you're not able to process the information because maybe something was said and it triggered you. We'll go back to that trigger, and we end up in a little bit of a pickle of a conversation that we didn't intend to have because we suddenly weren't feeling good. The other pieces are, I want you to be gathering your information. As soon as you know that IEP meeting's coming, start gathering your information. So gathering your reports, gathering the all about me conversation. So what I try to encourage parents to do in August is start doing an all about me on your kiddo and get it in for that first week of September. They're not going to ask you for it. You just do it. Just get it in there, because if we're waiting until October, November for the IEP meeting to be triggered, and they don't have current information, because something's magical about summer. I don't know what it is, but that vitamin D like transforms our kids, and all this stuff happens, and it's such a dramatic change in 2 months. Get that all about me in. I got some sheets again and the handouts that you guys will receive that'll help trigger some thoughts on how to do it, and get that in first week. Send it in to your resource teacher, send it into the teacher if you know who your teacher is, and have that stuff ready. And then have a copy of it when the IEP meeting comes, so you have that information. So any kind of reports you want to gather, if you need somebody to be there, maybe you need to have your behavior consultant there. Maybe you need to have your RDI consultant or your speech language pathologist. Book them right away. Like, don't wait till the last minute. One of my famous things is almost everything is I'm a procrastinator, because my ADHD goes, I can do it. All of a sudden I'm like, darn, I didn't do it. And all of a sudden I'm up against a deadline. And so try to avoid those situations so that you're front loading yourself as best as possible. Gather that team. Maybe you just need a friend there who could just ground you, and that's okay. It's okay just to have someone there, just to be present with you. It's okay to have someone waiting outside. Maybe you don't want them in, but they're waiting outside for you. That's okay. Maybe the other parent needs to be there and you want them there, so get them going. Maybe you need an advocate there who's going to take notes. That's not uncommon, because so much information is coming through the meeting. You want someone there to capture information. Maybe you need an advocate there who's going to also speak on your behalf. That's okay also. So you want to gather that team, get them ready, create your notes, all the questions you want to ask, get them going, have them ready, assemble your history, and identify your goals. With your goals that you identify for the IEP, I want you to, again, front load the school and submit it, because the more information they have in that all about me and goals, that gives them instant information to start building that IEP. So when they come to you with, we got 30 minutes for an IEP meeting, you've given the meat of that IEP, you've given the heart of it already, and you're not going to be sitting there going back and forth on these thoughts. You will have already preempted all of that. Your voice is already being heard. And hopefully now the framework of that IEP is going to show up at that table with your voice in it already versus not quite yet. And it's a really great way to front load the school. It's a great way to front load that teacher, so the teacher knows who they're receiving and how to best support them, even without an updated IEP. So I want you to understand, even without that updated IEP, let's say the IEP meeting doesn't kick off till November, your last year's IEP still remains intact, and they are following that until that new IEP comes, okay? So it's super important to understand that. So when we're talking about all this front loading, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create experiences of success. We're trying to get that collaborative relationship going. We're trying to get that child up top, so the parents are the strong foundation. So if you can imagine this image that my eldest drew for us, it's a triangle, and the base of the triangle is the strength of the foundation of that relationship. And we want the adults at the bottom lifting up that child, because if they're working well, without a doubt, our child has greater chances of success in that classroom, with their academics, whatever it means, because the communication's going, we're less triggered, the educator's less triggered, their teachers too. You might even have a teacher who has a child with needs, has stuff going on in the background that they're not talking about. So we want to be cognizant of all these different kinds of moving parts. And so keeping that basic level of advocacy moving, so that we're pulling that child up and keeping ourselves student-centered, student-supported for the emotional well-being of the child. Because when our children are doing well, their minds are going to follow. And when I work with our educators, what I'm always encouraging them is going, when it comes to co-regulation in the classroom, so when we capture their hearts, their mind will follow. We don't need to go after academics first. We go after their heart, that Self-reg is all built around feeling safe. So that comes to that co-regulation, that you're safe with me, you can work with me, I'm here for you, I hear you. And that's our first goal when our kiddos are feeling safe. Even us as adults, if we're in a relationship and we're not sure of that other person's intention, we're not going to open up full dialogue. We're not going to share freely. We're not even going to trust. We'll be watching with skepticism and uncertainty of where we stand in that relationship. Our children don't have that acute articulation, but their senses know it, and their responses to it, and I'm not going to say behavior, their responses to that relationship will show up in distrust of don't touch me, get away, no, I'm not listening to you. My guy, it is funny. I'm sorry. I think it's funny. It's my bad sense of humor. We didn't use profanities. We don't use profanities at home. And so he did not have tools to insult with. So he would call his teacher a dumbhead and a fathead. Don't talk to me. You're a dumbhead. You don't know how to teach. You're a fathead. Don't teach me. It's not your right to ask what's in my head. And he would do these things. And because he wasn't feeling safe, he would just totally, it's none of your business. And he would tell them outright, it's none of your business what's in my head. And I, like I'd cringe. I'd be like, oh my gosh, this is what he's doing. But at the end of the day, he's right. He's not safe. He's not feeling secure. They're not co-regulating with him. They're not hearing him. So he can't enter into a relationship with them to go, I can receive now what you're about to give to me. And so the cycle continued until we mastered what it meant to capture the child's heart so that their mind will follow. It's a pretty easy principle. It's all about trust. All right, so where do we go from here? So here we go. The personal support's really important. Talked about this. We want to make sure that we're starting with the end goal in mind. This becomes a really sensitive point of conversation for me. You'll hear many people say, well, the IEP, it's year to year. Yes, it is year to year. I want you to always be thinking a couple of years ahead, though, for your child with your goals. So you want to pull ahead. Will it meet where we're trying to go down here? And then come back here, and will it function in this year? So it's out and then in, and then out and in. So for example, my middle child, super tender spirited child. He's a young man now, he's in his 20s. But when he was little, super tender spirited and a bit of an introvert, extrovert personality. So with his peers, meaning kiddos his age group, didn't really connect with them very well. So he didn't have a lot of friends. So what did he do? He would always attract older kiddos as his buddies. And the kiddo was twice exceptional, meaning he was gifted intellectually. His IQ was high and hit those academic markers like easily, but was autistic. So those social emotional pieces were delayed. So when we're looking at IEPs, there are different sensory experiences that we have to pay attention to so that he can succeed in the class here. And then there was a social emotional learning that we had to attach here, but I also wanted it to address down here. Down here meant I knew, because I had homeschooled him, that his supports, if I didn't set them up properly, would have him bored at school and then potentially lose him to dropping out because he would get emotionally isolated. He was finishing his curriculum half a year early easily when I was homeschooling him. So I would have to extend those things and figure out, how do I set up those supports for this guy and make things work, and making sure everything's aligning and getting ready for the changes. So what did I do? So I started looking, okay, so by the time he's in grade 7, grade 8, I may have to jump him a grade. So aligning the goals, setting up those supports for him and in the IEP with the school, and looking down the road and stacking that IEP towards this end goal. So that end goal was the social emotional jump that he was going to have to do with his peers. So what we're going to do is look at that conversation when we're setting up those goals and making sure it's speaking short-term, long-term. So we're providing space for that stretch to happen. I've heard people say The goals should not be repeating themselves. That's false. It's okay for goals to repeat themselves. The strategies is what is evolving. If we said the goals should not repeat themselves, my son who couldn't read from grade 1 to grade 4 would have got completely lost because the goal would have fallen off the IEP. The strategies to tackle that goal, to support that goal is what needs to change. And I want you to remember that the strategies are what changes, and the goals only change if they have succeeded them. If the child hasn't succeeded them, that goal should not be removed from the IEP. So going back to my middle child now, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, his peers are in an age ahead of him, a year ahead of him. He was in DL in grade 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In grade 7, his grade 8 peers were going into grade 9. In that school, they graduated out at grade 9. So when my son was going to go into grade 8, his peers would be going out. When he was going into grade 9, his peers would be gone. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose this kiddo. Because his spirit was so sensitive, he was prone to depression. He was prone to mental health issues. And it's really important we're understanding the full picture here and these impacts. So because of this gentle spirit he was, and how it affected his personhood and how he viewed himself as a person, these peers became really critical part of that social emotional development. So then when we got to that year where he was supposed to be going into grade 8, I advocated for him to go into grade 9. I knew he could do it. I was 110% confident. District said, no, we don't do these things. Actually, the district didn't say it. The school said, we don't do these things. And I said, why not? Because it's just something, it's not a practice we do. Keyword, it's not a practice. It's not in the ministry laws. So when you hear those key language again, tune in. If it's not something we do. Historically, we've never done this, or we've always done it this way. None of that means law. Okay, so I said, I want you to bring this forward to the district. I want to see this guy graduate with his peers, and so that he's also intact psychologically, emotionally, in his spirit and his heart, so I don't lose him. And then I put a proposal forward as part of what I was going to suspect they were going to say is a roadblock. The roadblock is going to be the math curriculum primarily because it builds upon itself. So I said, this is what I'm prepared to do. With his agreement, we'll put him in grade 9 with your support, have him do the grade 8 math as well while he's in grade 9. If by Christmas he's succeeding that grade 8 maths as well as completing his grade 9 curriculum successfully, we drop that grade 8 math and move him on. They went, okay, we'll risk it. Away we went, and he did it. We actually ended up dropping the grade 8 math early because he was at top marks, and it was like clear that he didn't have any struggles. The point of the story again is how you're setting up the goals is making sure you're looking ahead and pulling forward. Sometimes that's hard to do. You're looking at your child's gifts and abilities, where their passions lie. And in this case, it was my kiddo. I had to look at where his heart was, what was going to affect his spirit. Academically, he was fine. And at the end of the day, the academics were inconsequential if I lost him. Simple as that. And that's what I was concerned of. What if I lose this guy because he's now isolated? And that can become a really big deal for our guys, our kiddos in their years of puberty. So we want to pay attention to those short-term goals, long-term goals, roll them over, change the strategies, okay? The question I want you to ask yourself as well when you're doing the goals, I want you to write this down if you have a pen. I want you to ask yourself, are the goals achievable? So when I mean that, for example, on an IEP I have in front of me from a district I won't name, and I won't name the child, but the goal, the method of evaluation to achieve a goal, which is so-and-so can approach and engage others for social play. This is on our core competency IEP for social play. If problems arise, the so-and-so will sometimes have volatile reactions. I was like, wow, that's horrible. Why would we use the word volatile? There might be adverse reactions we don't like. And this guy's in elementary, just a little kiddo. So what are we doing? The evaluation was self-evaluation. That's not achievable. It's actually setting him up for failure, because if he's struggling with emotional connection, with interoceptive functioning, he's not able to tune in. He needs somebody to self-regulate with him. And so I'm like, guys, we need to change this outcome to evaluation using the emotion wheel with an SCA, somebody who's walking him through how to tap into himself so he can evaluate where he came from to where he's going to go. Elementary kiddo who is struggling with interoceptive functioning, delayed executive functioning, autistic brain, hardwired, and constantly under bombardment from the sensory input in the classroom, that self-evaluation, 9 times out of 10 our kiddos are going to fail themselves on it. And then they're going to get affected in their spirit. They're not going to think they're good enough. They're not going to think they achieve. And it's going to affect how they view themselves as they go into their teenage years. And that's a concern. So please make sure you're questioning yourself in that process. Are the goals achievable? Okay, so planning and preparing. It's talking to the school, preparing them, which I said, front load them, front load them, front load them. Put everything in writing. Get if you're just starting off your IEP cycle, get those assessments in ahead of time. Don't wait for the IEP meeting. Get the assessments in. Get to that all about me in. Any questions you might have, I would put them in as well in writing ahead of time so that they're aware of what's on your mind and heart. Because this way they might be able to address it through that IEP working document you guys are going to have right away. And so getting that stuff in there right away gives you more time to understand the other things that you didn't think of and have those deeper conversations in that half hour, 45 minutes, and if you're fortunate, an hour. Okay. And you're planning and preparing. You may also want to be aware that there's a case called the Hugo Moore court decision from 2006. It's a really important court case that went through the Supreme Court through Abbotsford, and it was a ruling about support services for our children and their rights. That's a really great document for you to look up and be aware of so that it helps you understand where you need to be. Here we go, self-care again. I'm always going to repeat this. I want you to pay attention to where you're at in your meetings. Going into your meetings, your anxiety may come up. Anxiety doesn't always look like heart flutters. Anxiety can look like fatigue. It can look like excessive hunger, lack of hunger. It can look like anger. It can look like sadness. It can look like withdrawal. It takes on different faces depending on the person and how they've been working through with themselves over the years. And sometimes it is that massive rush in your chest and your belly's getting overloaded. Sometimes it's that. Each one of us will engage in it differently. So be aware of that so then you can understand where your triggers might lie and what's moving your body so you know how to enter into that meeting well. So again, it's eating well, sleeping well. Remove some stressors if you can the day before. Without a doubt, for me, didn't matter how many times I've been into an IEP meeting. The day before, I needed to remove stressors and I needed to not have any demands on me right after the meeting, because there's this level of letdown that occurs, whether it was a good meeting or not. If it's a good meeting, you're like, whew, oh, that went well, that was awesome. And if it was a bad meeting, you get in your car, you might have a meltdown. I know I have many times, or you go see somebody, start talking about it, you think you weren't that impacted, all of a sudden your emotions show up. So it's just making sure that you're caring for yourself, because there's so many demands on us as parents, with the advocacy all the way around in the medical system, within the family structures, teaching people about the diagnosis ongoing, and working on that level of acceptance with others for your family structure and the advocacy within the system. Your lines of communication, what are they in the school? Okay, so this is important as well, so that we're working towards that collaborative communication again. Helping people feel safe, it really becomes an important part. If we don't go through those lines of communication, it makes people feel uneasy. and rightfully so. So your lines of communication will start with your classroom teacher, not your SEA. Your SEA is not the first person ever you're supposed to start with. That doesn't mean your SEA doesn't have a great voice, an important voice. They absolutely do. They tend to know our kiddos best. And I would always be advocating to have my SEA present at all IP meetings if possible. And if they can't be present, then asking them to submit something that they could speak life into the IEP meeting on behalf of your child and their experience with your child. So your line of communication for advocacy starts with the teacher, and then it goes to the resource teacher. So if you're having a challenge, you send the teacher a letter, get 3 weeks back and forth with letters. Let's pretend I'm going to build some kind of scenario. You're not getting it resolved, then it goes to the resource teacher. But please, when you send it to the resource teacher, keep that teacher on the communication line. The to line in your email is the person you want to respond to the email. The CC line is for your eyes, but not to respond. I'm not looking for you to respond, but I'm being transparent with you and I'm showing it to you. So when you're going to the resource teacher, put their name in the to line and bump the teacher down to the CC line, because you're now looking for that resource teacher to respond. That's who you're asking information from. And then you're saying to the teacher, hey, I'm just letting you know I'm opening this conversation up. And let's pretend it continues to go sideways. Now we need the principal. So then we put the principal in the to line, we bump the other ones down. God forbid it continues to still go sideways. You go up to your district, learning support services. Typically that's the name for the director that looks over inclusive learning in your district. It's typically universal, but I'm not going to guarantee that. We've got 63 districts in this province, and we know each district, unfortunately, there's no continuity going on that allows us to have, that ability to move from one district to the next and go, okay, this is this, right? We know exactly who we need to go to. It's convoluted. So your teacher, your resource teacher, your principal. If you're in a middle high school and you happen to have a vice principal, then that vice principal assigned to you is who you go to instead of the principal. And in that case, it would be teacher, resource teacher, vice principal, and then principal, and then director of learning support. You're still hitting walls after director of learning support. You go up to your assistant superintendent. Each district will have superintendents who are assigned over a certain number of schools in your district. Often there's 2 assistant superintendents in the medium to large districts, and they're divided in half. Find out who that assistant sup is for that school of yours, and then it goes up there, and all these other people are in your CC line. It continues to fail. Then you go to your superintendent. After that, you section 11 the board. Now understand, when you section 11 a board, it's a complicated process and convoluted. And what you want to do is be very clear in what your advocacy is, and be very clear that your child has an IEP and a diagnosis, so that it's abundantly clear what parts of that BC Education Act is encompassed in looking at that section 11. Super important information. Section 11 gets denied, let's pretend. So then you can go to your ombudsman or Human Rights Tribunal. You can also include your MLA. They'll just hear you. They're not going to do much, but they can hear you and maybe if they got a good ear and a heart for inclusion and disability rights and intersectionality conversation, the rights of minorities, then that person might do a good job advocating into the ministry, to the Ministry of Education. But essentially you want to do your ombudsman and HRT. And in all honesty, if you're going up that high, if you're going to HRT, Human Rights Tribunal, do the ombudsman as well anyway, because it's just good to log it there. And they may not do anything. It may just be a log, but a certain number of logging ins calls for an evaluation. So then you go up, and then at some point, certainly with the section 11, you'll get pushed back down to a certain degree to try to create resolution. And then the HRT, it's a whole different conversation. So those are your lines moving upwards. Majority of the time, you don't have to go that high. I really want to be wise about how we move up the ladder in these conversations for trying to create resolution. If we go too high, some people will go into media. Always remember your child is the conversation. That stuff doesn't go away, especially if it hits the media. And the child may not get named because they're a minor, but there will be pressure on the family structure. So as you're elevating, I want you to go back to that self-care line and go, can my family structure sustain the pressures we're about to walk through? Can we sustain the dynamics that are going to occur? Because they are oppressive often in nature. And do we have the financial capacity? Do we have the emotional capacity? Is that, if you're in a relationship with someone, is that relationship strong to support it? Because it can fracture that as well. So I want you to make sure you're analyzing all these pieces, because it's not just about, oh, I'm going to stick it to the man. I'm going to have to look at the full family structure and go, can we do this? Can we carry this? Or is there another approach, and what is it? For example, when I pulled my kiddo, I had to look at the conversation of, is there any point to continue elevating this? Is it going to get me anywhere? It might get my voice heard a little bit, but is it going to help him? And I knew resoundingly it's not going to benefit him at all. Nothing was going to change. His anxiety is still going to be up, and I still need to address it. So I just went, done. I literally went, I'm done. This is why I'm done. I cited the reason. I pulled this guy out and did my thing. And then he succeeded as a result. And at the end of the day, that's the goal. The goal is to have the child succeed, not to be right. Two different conversations. So I want us to be sure we're understanding what, especially our foundation family structures, can sustain in these conversations. Keeping a record, super duper important. Keeping a record is part of what we're going to do right now, which is learning about that binder. But before we go into the binder, what I want you to know is when you have a conversation, let's say on the phone with an educator or your school, whatever, send them an email, thank them for their time. Cite briefly, keep your communication super brief, please. Cite briefly what you guys agreed, what you guys talked about. Maybe we talked about having more sensory breaks during the day, because it'll help Lee focus better. So having the more sensory break during the day we agreed on, and I look forward to hearing the outcome of this. When you have those conversations, those are adjustments to the IEP actually. We're adding a support in there. So you want to record that you had that conversation so it's logged, right? The conversation might be very good conversation. I hope for everyone that the conversations are good, but still record them so you got a record, because if somewhere down the line something goes sideways, you have it there. Okay, so keeping records important, and then creating that binder is where we're going to go. So creating the binder, in your handouts that you're going to get a number of different sheets, and one of them is going to look like this in essence. It's going to have this information on it. In your binder, you're going to create a sleeve that's subtitled communication. And in it, you're going to have a space you're going to create a contact list of all the people that you're going to be needing to have access to. So their names, their email, and their phone number. Your communication log. So I talked to Suzanne on September 23rd by phone. On September 28th, I emailed Suzanne as a follow-up. Okay, so you're keeping that record there, so you can go, no, actually we talked on this day, and you have that verification there. Your letters and emails to and from the school, you're going to print them out as they're happening and put them in. Your binder is going to be a year-by-year binder, okay? Don't roll more than 1 year into a binder, because it becomes confusing and becomes too complex. So that first section is going to have communication. The second one, oh, I'm going to pause for a second. In that binder, what I'm sending you as well under communication is going to be the parent input for the IEP. You're going to get a sheet for that. You're going to get a sample advocacy letter for communication. Okay, so I'm going to, oh, you guys don't get to see me. That's too bad. All right, so I can't even show you. Shoot. So in the handout, you're going, yes, Anne?
I'm just, if you would for a moment, you can turn off your slide sharing and then you could show them the binder.
Oh,
And
aren't you?
yeah, that would work.
Aren't you smart? See, I'm good with words, not technology. So stop share.
Yes.
Awesome. You're so good. All right. So what I'm going to show you now is you're going to get a sample letter that's going to be really lengthy like this. That is not the letter I want you guys to be writing as a typical experience to your schools. On the side of the letter, you're going to see these small thoughts that are triggering off, and they're to coach you how to write a simple technical letter. So you're starting off with thanking them for their work, the why of the letter. This is why I'm writing. Keep it simple. And then bullet point, literally bullet point your challenges that are faced. So maybe, you know, in my case, when I'm asking for more sensory breaks, that he's really tired at the end of the day, super lethargic. He's having meltdown when he comes home, and he's feeling like he's bored at school. So he may need more sensory breaks. So that's what we're looking for. So the impact of the challenges are it's affecting how he's viewing himself. It's affecting how he's viewing school, and therefore affecting his relationships with his peers and his siblings, and his ability to follow through with work, schoolwork. The goal is to help him feel more refreshed and like he can accomplish his outcomes. Close it with a thank you very much, send it off. You want majority of your communication to be simple. And the reason why you want that is so that the educator is able to ingest the information that you're providing for them. When we make the emails too lengthy, it's difficult to separate emotion from the ask. Okay, a lot of our letters are filled with emotions. We want to make sure that we're going right to the ask. We're building the framework so it's short and clear and concise. And so you're going to have that sample advocacy letter in your handouts that will go under communication. Also under communication, you'll have a handout that says the student's voice. And this is for your older students to get them involved in teaching them for self-advocacy. You'll also have for yourself to use in your IEP meetings a template for an IEP agenda. It's not to be given to them. It's just something to keep you on track to make sure that you're able to guide yourself. Maybe you need to remember things, certain subpoints you want to remember coming in because you forgot to send it in earlier, whatever. And then for our primary kiddos, we have a sheet that's called Recognizing the Good Stuff. So that's basically an all about me that you're going to work with your kiddo on to get in at the beginning of the year. And then also you're going to have a handout that says words we can use. So what I'm trying to do in this piece is going, instead of the word violence, for example, we can say Lee is distressed, or Lee is maladaptive coping. Lee is having stress responses. So trying to provide some different vocabulary to use that sets the child up for success in that IEP. And using those pieces there for you so that that child is not being viewed through a lens that becomes a punitive approach, which is very challenging. And that's often what happens when we don't use the right language. It kind of sets a framework on how we're viewing the child. The next section I want you to create is called evaluation. So make yourself a title page that's called evaluation. And under that, you're going to submit these different areas that I've assigned A, B, and C. Not everybody's going to, not all school districts give the consent to evaluate, but if you can get copies, do that. I didn't do that the first time and they misplaced. Not only did they misplace my request, he ended up not getting evaluated for extra period of time because it was misplaced. And once we found it, then we got him on an emergent list. But anything you can have copies of, it's great to have copies of. Your private evaluations, always keep a copy of that in your binder. Again, pull out that family information, don't keep it in the binder, and please, in all the documentation, redact, black out your child's name and his PIN number, and if the medical number is there, black that out as well. So this way, if you accidentally misplace the binder, that really critical information isn't exposed to somebody in the public, okay? So having those evaluations year to year in there is important so you can go back to them if you need them. The IEP, you want a copy of your previous year IEP in there so that you can refer to it as a template to go back to, and a jumping point of going, hey, wait a minute, that goal didn't show up here, and I want to make sure that goal is rolling over. Then you got it there, and you don't have to try to go by memory. And then the other piece I want you to encourage you to have is that what I mentioned earlier this evening is the manual policy, procedures, and guidelines. And that's found on the ministry website. You literally type that in and it'll pop up for you. A section for your report cards and progress notes, and then that other section for communication that the school calls quote unquote behavior, which I really don't like. And all that communication that's there. So again, you can be evaluating how things are progressing, what needs to evolve, where the growing edges are to move forward. So all that being said, and that will give you a binder. So what I'd like you to do with your binders now is you create a binder and I'm going to stop screen sharing again, just for a moment, if that's okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to just go to the dollar store and get a simple 3-ring binder, just a simple one with a sleeve in the front so that you can put a picture of your child there. Okay, please have a picture of your child. Yes, they know what he looks like, but it doesn't matter. This way we're keeping student-centered in that IEP meeting. And then on the inside of your binder, you're going to have your sleeves, put lined paper in there as well so that you've got a place to take notes. I want you in your pocket to have some tissue in there for yourself. I got a rock here that says goals. I got a sensory tool because I like sensory tools because it helps me when I'm anxious, and put gum or candy in it for you, and some tabs to use in case you need to flag something. So why do we have these things? Well, the candy or gum is really fabulous for you to help you from a self-reg perspective, simply put. What it's going to do is it's going to allow your left brain and right brain to work together. It's going to start talking together, and it'll help reduce. It's not going to eliminate, but it's going to help reduce your anxiety levels and your stress levels, because your brain is busy working on holding that gum in your mouth. It's creating saliva, it's enjoying the taste, and you're working hard on not spitting it out by accident when you're talking. And so it's doing that little bit of self-reg on a very subconscious level. The tissue's there simply because there's times where we do break down in those meetings. And those are very, very difficult experiences. And you don't want yourself in a situation where you break down and the tears are flowing and you're uncomfortable and your nose is running and everybody's like, oh, and so someone gets up to go get tissue and the whole room falls quiet and you're left isolated. It's a terrible place to be. So this is just simply self-care kit that I want you to inject into that binder so you feel those emotions coming, you can grab your tissue and you can care for yourself, and you maintain where you need to be in that meeting. If at any time you feel like you need to stop the meeting, you're allowed to do that. If you say, I need to pause to step out, I need to go refresh myself, go do it. And if you're feeling that experience, go put some cold water on your wrist, please. Just lean over the sink and put your hands in the water. Let the cold water run on your wrists here in the soft spots. The reason why you do that is because it's going to bring your body temperature down really quickly and help you to get ready to go back in. Okay. The reason why I have that stone that says goals, it's a grounder. It's reminding me why I'm there. So sometimes words are really powerful for us to look at and go, right, I got to focus on this. It's my goal. What's my goal? What's my goal? I'm here for this, whatever it may be. Sometimes you might want something else, like you can do it, or I believe in you. The sensory tool for me is because I fidget a lot. I'm a fidgeter and I need it for part of my grounding. It helps my brain work, same as what that gum does. All right. And then that, again, the tabs, the sticky note things is just an important part so that you can flag those important pieces if you need to. To put a binder together, it costs you maybe $10. And every year you do a new one, and only keep one binder from the previous year, shred the other documentation. You don't need to hold on to it for 10 years, and your kiddos definitely don't need to have access to it. And some of them definitely don't want to see it. So that brings us now to where we are at the end of the meeting, our presentation, and to remind ourselves that inclusion is not a program, but it's really a mindset of social integration, how we treat each other, how we work through language and empathy to support each other, to support our children, to get them into that space of success with their IEPs, to grow and become whomever they've been created to be as young adults. And so now, Anne, I'm going to open us up for questions. If we have any questions, we can do that.
Great. I'm just going to, people can see your website and where to reach you at. And then I'm just going to invite you to stop screen sharing so that they can see your lovely face.
Oh, bless you.
And I'll send the questions your way.
Okay.
Thank you so much for talking through the process and breaking down the different pieces. I think sometimes when you're dropped into the IEP process, you actually don't, you're just in it. You don't know where you're in it, but you're in it somewhere. So let's see, we have several comments coming.
And that's an important thought, what you just said, Anne, while you're navigating that. My very first IEP meeting, I hadn't a hot clue that I was in an IEP meeting. Nobody told me that I was going into an IEP meeting. They asked me a bunch of questions. The kindergarten teacher got mad at me, and I was like, what's going on? And why is all this elevation occurring? And why are you upset with my thought? You asked me a question, I answered, when her question was, you know, what's your long-term goal for your son? And I said, well, I want him to grow up to be able to operate in his gifts and abilities, however they may work, and be independent one day, whatever that means for him, whatever that means, his level. And she got mad. She said, well, what about school? I said, well, what do you mean, what about school? And she said, well, where is that in the conversation? I went, well, that's part of the process. You asked me the goal. You didn't ask me the steps. She lost it. Right? Had no idea. I didn't realize for 2 years after that that's what I was in. It took me that long to tune in and go, oh, that's what we were doing. Okay, that was terrible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you are the process. That's the goal.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. You are the process. And we have to always, that's why I keep focusing on that goal. What is it attainable? Is it right? And it needs to be able to roll over if it has to, right? It's the strategies, the supports that shift, right?
Some comments coming in. Last year, I was told by my son's case manager that we could not do modifications when I requested them. Where do you go from there?
I would go straight to the principal, bypass resource teacher. I'd go straight to the principal and get a clarification why. And if they say, again, that important language, well, this is the way we do it. You're looking for policy now. Where's the policy, right? The way we've always done it, or this is the way we do it, or this is our best practices, is not policy. So what you want them to do is show you policy. And if the parent believes that the child needs a modification, the parent's allowed to request that.
What if the parent disagrees with the school's assessment for the child? How can that be shown in the IEP?
That's a really good question. And it's not, I would have to bore down into that question more, to be honest with you, Anne, because what is that parent interpreting as assessment? Is it assessment that this child will succeed in classroom A versus classroom B? Is it assessment on the psych ed assessment? What are they looking at there? It's not clear enough for me.
And sometimes it's the language too. I know for myself, again, being dropped into, here we are, hit the ground running. Sometimes we're not always using the same terminology. So, if the person that put that comment in could clarify, because in general, the school is not doing the assessments.
That's
An
right.
outside resource or the district psychologist is doing the assessment. So if you want to clarify that, then we can circle back to that question. Just a comment, I have been that angry mama bear while it did lead to the outcome we needed. It was sad that it really had to get to that point.
Yeah, it is sad. It's discouraging and it doesn't feel good. It takes a piece away of us, right? And it wears us down, not just even for that hour, for a couple of days. And it creates a point of impact. In fact, if it happens enough, that traumatic impacts can occur, which is what causes high anxiety about going into IEP meetings. And so, those are times where we really need to work on being kind with ourselves and mindful with our thoughts afterwards. And you know what, like, and I say this to educators and parents alike, if there's parts where we have to own and go back and say, hey, you know what, I was out of line, that's okay to do, because that's part of relationship building, right? Like, all our relationships, doesn't matter, in our marriages and our friendships with our kids and even with our colleagues, we have these friction points, and it's okay to go and re-correct that, and that actually strengthens relationships and it builds trust. And a lot of our educators are really learning how difficult it is for us when we're coming to the table, especially when we're carrying that load alone and we're not being heard, or we feel like we're not being heard, and then we have those pops. I've had them myself. I really have. And have I had fractured relationships with educators? I had one in the whole milieu of my time in education, where it remained fractured. It was a very difficult no turnaround, and I'm okay with that. And there's sometimes there's those relationships in life in general where we need to step away because it's unhealthy, period. And do we have to work with that person? Well, for a period of time, yes, we do. But if that relationship is that toxic, then request the principal to be present if it remains toxic, if there's no opportunity for reconciliation. But I would always move towards, hey, you know what, if I stepped out of line, and there's times I've stepped out of line and I've gotten elevated, I had to go back and say, you know what, I was out of line. I'm sorry, and it doesn't mean I'm sorry for what I said. It was how I said it, because what I said needed to be communicated, but I may have come across incredibly forceful. And so those are the pieces where that self-reflection and growth comes in. And those are good, those are okay experiences. Even though they feel terrible, they're growing edges for ourselves.
There you go, human.
Right, exactly.
Suggestions on how to address lack of support since my child kind of fades in the background, competing with other kiddos that struggle with tricky physical behavior. So it sounds like advocating for a child who doesn't have the immediate emerging things compared to other children in the classroom.
So that child often needs to be placed closer to the teacher, to be honest with you. And those are simple things, right? Closer connection. They just need to have that proximity, and it's a body mirroring experience is what it is. And so often that's a helpful tool. Getting a requesting in the IEP as a support, having let's say the child's in grade 3, having a grade 6 buddy coming in and reading, or doing reading, writing support, whatever. Like, just creating some of those body mirroring experiences are often helpful for those kiddos who are struggling in that way, because when they start fading into the background, they're disconnecting also in mind, and they're going into their own safe space. And so having that body mirroring is really great. Also, extrasensory breaks. Like, that was my guy. He was really, really gifted. And so he wasn't in tune all the time with what was going on in class. So he would just get lost. And because he was quiet, he would just fade off into the distance. And so it was like, no, we got to get this guy doing things that are different. And that's okay. But let's get him moving. Sometimes it's getting up and moving. He would one of the big things is he was organizing the library often in the classroom. And then so what the teacher started doing is using a few kids to clean up the library. And this way he wasn't singled out. It was a classroom thing.
Mm-hmm. Clarification has come in. It was the classroom teacher's assessment, or about the earlier question, if you disagree with the assessment. Okay,
so assessment being a test then? Is that what we're saying by assessment, a class test? Because that would be the only...
there's more clarification. So basically in my school, the assessment is done by the classroom teacher and the learning support teacher. In the IEP meeting, I've always disagreed with the assessment, and my BCBA backs me up. But that contradiction between our parent and BCBA versus the assessment of the school.
So if the school-based team, because it feels suspect that a teacher's making an assessment versus a school-based team. And so if there's something going on with a teacher and resource teacher and there's a conflict, then I would be requesting a school-based team meeting to come in and look at that. So now what will happen is staff from the district will come in from learning support services and help provide support to that school and look at the global conversation of what's going on and start remeasuring everything.
I would just add to that, at any given time, it's not the teacher's place to be making an assessment outside of assessing reading levels or where they're at academically, but the more in-depth assessments happen outside of the classroom. The teacher can recommend or suggest, but so there might be some stepping there.
Convoluted lines of roles. And so I would always encourage, when that kind of stuff is going on, if it's happening, then that principal needs to be brought in. The principal at the end of the day is accountable for how the management of that school occurs. And, and that advocacy up of school-based, again, through the principal school-based team meeting to occur.
What's the correlation between Safety Plan and WorkSafe BC? How does the process work?
Yeah, that one's really complicated and convoluted. And Safety Plan really is, if my kiddo, and he was very physical when he was little, he never got physical with the educators, or at school, period. He was only physical with me, but we always had to be aware that could occur. And so having that safety plan is just making sure it's really there to protect the educators, so that it's known that we have a child that can get heavily dysregulated and needs extra supports, and to prove to WorkSafe. Essentially anything with WorkSafe, you're having to prove the case, right? And so it's proving documentation there.
Okay. My child is in middle school. Last year, the IEP meetings were only the resource teacher and the CEA. What are policies about staff from the school that attend, and what would best practice be? This year, the resource teacher and CEA are new to my child.
CEA, I don't know what a CEA, that might be a typo, it might be SEA. The classroom teacher, the class manager teacher must be there. And resource teacher, often the SEA, if that's, I'm thinking they're thinking SEA versus CEA. I don't know what a CEA is. And if the classroom teacher can't be there, then the request for the principal to be present.
To the parent who asked about, there was an early question about modification. Schools are reluctant to do modifications until high school. This is different from an adaptation. So I just wanted to, again, re-emphasize, because I know it was at the beginning of your presentation, but that distinction between adaptation and modification is very important. And I think a lot of parents don't realize until they're hitting that grade 9, grade 10 spot about how
to divide it,
how it diverges.
Yeah.
And you might have set up a road that it's very hard to come back to.
Yeah, and you're right, and that's where that if you got modifications, typically I'd be hard. Most schools are trying to move kiddos away from modification unless there's some very significant developmental disabilities occurring between grade 6 and grade 8, so that they can start scaffolding them going into high school on the adaptations to move them towards the dogwood. When we talk about inclusive education within the educational system, we're not there yet, which is why we have things like AdvoCon. But without a doubt, the conversation is getting better at inclusive learning graduation rates, and districts looking at those conversations and moving from modification to adaptation is part of that critical piece of the conversation. And how do we do that? How do we front load, and how do we support that student getting into that direction? And you're right, we need to pay attention to that language. It's very, very important.
I can just speak from my own experience. When my child's in 4th grade now. And so when we have our IEP meetings, the tendency is to, let's, do a really attainable goal. And I said, at the end of the year, whether she hits the goal or not, does not matter to me, one hill of beans. I'm just always trying to find her edge, right?
That's
so
right.
If we aim to here and we know that we're probably going to end up here, great. But if we push to here, and I think their concern is that we'll push too hard. I said, it's not that at all. We just want to let's let her, give her rein to go and the support to go. And
if she can't get there and she gets here, then that's where she gets, right? And that's speaking directly to those goals, pulling out, pulling in, pulling out. And I love the language you use about, learning her edge. Where's her edge, right? With my guy, what I figured out, and I keep going back to the youngest one, what I figured out with him, because he was so kinetic, I figured out his edge really meant, let's get him on his feet while he's learning. So I would have frequent pull-out experience because he didn't do great on push-in. So push-in is he's in the classroom. Pull-out is coming out of the classroom into a quieter space. He did best on pull-out, especially in the primary years. And by the time he was ready for secondary, he was all in on only out during tests. But his pull-out experience, what I did is I went to Michael's and the dollar store and bought all these wooden painting things that you paint, right? Like, so I bought him this big castle and he painted while the SCA would read to him. He started learning and answering questions and finishing assignments in record time. He started demonstrating what he actually had because he was busy. He was doing his thing. He was building confidence because it was like, look at, you got it done today. You got it all done today. Never mind taking 2 weeks to finish a sheet, because that's what was occurring, right? Because it was like, sit down, let's do it. And I was like, oh, this isn't working. So I said, let's try this. So I just front loaded and bought all this stuff. He thought the SCA bought it all for him, and she was the superstar. He ended up memorizing her birthday. Hers was the first birthday he ever memorized out of anybody in his world. He still knows it at 18 years old and still talks about her. She's made such an impact. And so it's actually, it's that edge, like what you're talking about. Let's pull it, let's push it, see where we can go. And sometimes it's being creative. And I leaned into the UDL, Universal Design and Learning curriculum that we have in our province that we have access to. And so for him, it was that kinetic learning. He's going to paint this castle while he was learning about medieval times. It tied in together, it worked, and it got him going. So doing that and catching it, right? And it's okay if they don't get over here. We shouldn't be expecting off the charts, but set the goal over there so they can go, this is where I'm heading towards. He graduated because of that thought process, and it's really good.
I think you alluded earlier at the very, very beginning to changes in the curriculum and how it can impact IEPs. Kind of.
Well, I talked about there's a core competency curriculum and the core competency IEP, and it definitely is because we're looking at the curriculum a little bit differently. And I struggle with the language. I struggle, I am autistic. I spoke with other autistic adults, had them look at this curriculum with me and independently without me saying my opinion about it. And it all came back the same, where the language it's tricky language because it's still catching kids and going, well, you're good at this, and therefore we're going to pop you into this hole and move around that. Well, by the time they get to grade 12 and they got to do their capstones, for those of you who have students in high school right now, we have this thing called capstones, which is an incredibly difficult project for our kiddos who struggle with interoceptive functioning. If you don't know what interoceptive functioning is, it's really this experience of being able to tap into self, into those sensory experiences, those calming experiences, knowing that mindfulness of self. So going beyond, I'm mad. How are you feeling today? I'm mad. What do you mean you're mad? I'm just mad. Why? I'm mad, right? They're not able to go deeper, right? And so there's the language and communication things that need to be addressed in there. And there's the social emotional strategies that need to be tapped into. This capstone, which is a requirement for graduation for a neurotypical kiddo, it's a semester course. My kiddo took a full year, literally. And I had to cross enroll him because I knew it was coming. I cross enrolled him ahead of time into another school that would allow him to take it at night, and that they would have a little less rigidity in the outcomes. And we worked on it. It took a year, and it's tapping into those pieces of the curriculum where it's lots of self-evaluation. So how did you do? I don't know. Well, okay, evaluate yourself here. How'd you do? poor, 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 or great, 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 right? There's no real true evaluation going on. It's just like doing it. And then going, well, what do you want to do when you're older? I don't know. Right? So it's saying we're tapping into your core competencies, but now what we're doing, we're saying, well, I can't even go that deep in myself because I haven't been taught. And then the IEPs, our core competency IEPs, are pushing into those pieces. Like I said with this earlier, there's one outcome. Well, method of evaluation. Here's one, sticky notes. That was this is a real IEP I'm looking at right now from a district. Method of evaluation, sticky notes for the child. And I'm saying, where are the sticky notes going? First, where are the sticky notes going? Well, it's a good question. I don't know. What's on the sticky notes? So now we have a potential experience of negative peer pressure reinforcement of behavior. Not cool. Child being exposed. Method of evaluation, self-evaluation. Are you kidding? I started off the meeting tonight going, and you said yourself, you got lots of expression. I'm going, oh, I'd never thought about that. I literally never thought about it before. I went, am I expressive? I don't know. Self-evaluation, that's an interoceptive functioning piece. I was just like, whoa, that was a good one. And I'm 51. And we're asking them to do it without teaching them. So those are some of those tricky pieces in the curriculum we need to pay attention to. And when I did my IEPs, I would ask them to please omit self-evaluation. And if you're going to do it, work with them with what's called an emotion wheel. So if you Google emotion wheel, you're going to come up with this beautiful color wheel, and it's going to have lots of information, like lots of emotions around it. The center of the wheel is our core emotions: mad, sad, joy, happy. Okay. And then it kind of bursts out into what looks like a spectrum. And so let's pretend my little guy comes home and he's mad. He's like, I'm mad. And I'm like, but you're crying. But I'm mad, Mom, and tears roll. I'm like, but you look sad, buddy. What's going on? What hurt your heart? Well, the kids wouldn't play with me and they took my ball. Oh, so that must have made you feel embarrassed that they took the ball. And you must have felt lonely. Did you feel lonely? So now I don't want to be projecting. Now I'm asking, did you feel lonely? Yes. Was that embarrassing for you? Yes. Okay. So he wasn't mad, but that's what he was able to identify with. Our job as the big people is to learn how to use that and help them go deeper into themselves so they can go, I feel abandoned today and lonely. I was on a playground by myself all day and nobody cared, right? And so that's self-evaluation. And then that needs to be able to transfer into those academic settings, right? And most of us don't even know that ourselves. Like I took a district through the conversation on this piece specifically, and I said, you're asking them to self-evaluate, and that they, the child should be able to evaluate and readjust their emotions and be in control. And they're like, yes. And I said, okay, you're in the kitchen and you're working, TV's on, kiddos are in the background, somebody's yelling out to you, you got the stove going, the dishwasher doors open, and you're going, just give me a few minutes, let me finish in here. You turn around to go to the fridge, you forget the dishwasher doors open, you clip the top of your foot because it's too close to the floor, and you jam your foot. What are you doing? What are you saying? The screen went quiet, and one of them said the F-bomb, and everybody laughed. I said, yep. I said, did you have self-regulation then? I said, you're human. The kids are human. We have to expect them to learn to go through those emotions. We haven't even mastered it. I said, but you were mad, but really you were hurt. You expressed anger, but you're really hurt. And they were just like, never thought about it like that. And so we need to be really cognizant of how we navigate the language in the IEPs so that we're supporting them well. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it did.
I think it did too. And what you're talking about takes so much work. I can relate one of my kids, it's happy, good, tired, or I hate you. And so
yes, I remember that.
happy, good, tired, or I hate you. And so teasing that out to the point where exactly what you're saying, like not telling them how they feel, but inviting a conversation like, oh, well, is it this or more like that?
Right.
To the point where now she can say, I feel really frustrated.
That's right.
Right. Oh my goodness. That's amazing. You feel frustrated.
Right. And then you know how to support.
Yeah.
Right. So what I read earlier is where, child had a volatile response. Well, that's actually probably not true at all to the heart and character of that child. That child's probably feeling frustrated, sad, and isolated. Yes. So if we knew the child's feeling sad, frustrated, and or isolated, then as adults, we can go, oh, I know how to support you differently. It's a different support. And that's why the language is so important.
And not to, correct me if I'm misunderstanding, the IEP then becomes about how we support the child, not how we manage the child's behavior.
Precisely. Yeah. And that's why I said when we look at this and we say that there's the word behavior. So here, very first page of this IEP, core competency IEP, assessment, medical diagnosis, student requiring behavior support. And I'm like, are you kidding me? No, student requires social emotional learning support. Different conversation. We're not managing behavior. We're teaching how to get in touch with ourselves. So we're able to externalize. If we say we're self-reg focused, if we say we're trauma-informed focused, if we say we're inclusive, then we must zero in on that social emotional learning and how to support it versus managing behavior. That's my heart on the matter. And I get in trouble for it, but I have to stand firm in that position, watching hundreds of children walk through IEPs and readjusting them and going, hey, you know what? Here's a simple example. When we look at language in IEPs and how it can manifest, our leaders' intentions are to support our kiddos, and I know that they chose a profession to be a part of a generation impactor. But when we get conditioned because the system and it's systematic, and we start believing language means something. And if I go, okay, well, I was named Suzanne. I'm quite confident I know my father named me, but I know he named me Suzanne for a reason because it had a meaning. And his heart's intention was the meaning would embed on me. And a lot of us as parents do that. When we pick our child's name, we're researching, what does this child's name mean? And we go, I like it. It works. It resonates. And if we watch, we see it actually show up in them. It's really interesting. And so we don't want those assessments first. It starts at the assessment. It starts at the doctor's office. The language needs to change. And I'm working hard to get tapped into psychologists to have this conversation. Change the assessment so when the assessments show up at the school, the IEP language changes. So that what's getting put upon the child and mirrored onto the child is grace and kindness, inclusiveness, trauma-informed practice, supporting the heart of the child. You're muted, Anne.
That is the perfect place to end, I think. I just, of course, that you said that I had to look up the meaning of Suzanne, and while the French is Lily, your sweet scent has really changed the aroma around IEPs, at least for me. And I hope that our attendees have experienced the same thing. I also see that there's a story of Susanna courageously defending against wrongful accusation.
Interesting, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that powerful?
Calling. What a powerful calling. And I feel like the people that are listening to you talk are equipped with tools and resources in order to not just defend, but to set the tone for not wrongful accusation, but a clear direction, and to be set up for the very best possible. So thank you so much for sharing from your heart and from your deep wisdom and experience. And what a gift you are to your own children and also to our community.
Oh, thank you. Bless you. And I like to thank our interpreters as well tonight for being with us. We couldn't get through this without you. And so thank you for your time. And thank you to our participants tonight. And again, if you have questions that are trickling down and they're not like, a 2-hour experience, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you. All right, Anne, thank you so much for your support tonight as well. It was great working with you.
My pleasure. Anytime.